Well, everyone, welcome to this afternoon's program. I'm so glad that you decided to join us. I'm really looking forward to the presentation. I'm just going to open with a word of prayer. We're going to jump straight in and get to business, get to work. I'm ready to learn some things that are going to make me a better husband. And, honestly, it's a big ask, right? Because, I'm a pretty amazing husband as it is, Dave. And I'm totally teasing. In the sincerity of my heart, I really do want God to speak to me because I want to be the best husband I can be, the best dad, the best person. And really, that's why we're here, to learn, to grow, and to experience God in a new way. So let me pray for you, Dave. I know you'll pray too, but I'll just open our time together with prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, it's an honor to speak to you. It's just astonishing that the creator of the universe, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords wants to hear from us. Weak, clueless humanity. We're in awe of the fact that you want to hear from us and that your tender, sensitive heart is moved by those that you've created, those that you love. And we thank you for loving us, for caring for us. And because you love us, because you care for us, we appeal to you now, Father, and ask that you would give us all your Spirit. And may we hear. Your word says, he that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says. So if you don't give us ears to hear, Father, we won't hear. So may our hearts and minds be open to the information that David is going to share, and please help us to learn to know how to apply it. That's really important, God, and we want that. So bless us now, Lord. We move forward in your name, trusting in your leadership and in your guidance. We pray this, Father, in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right. So everybody that's here, does everybody here have handouts? If you didn't get one from last night, okay, so we do have some up front, and maybe we can have some helping hands to distribute some of these. But it'd be good to have all three of them. So last night we had the one that was an introductory session. It's the R questionnaire. And so R is just an acronym. It's accessibility, responsiveness, and engagement. These are ways for us to know how we're generally doing as a couple. How are we doing responding to each other? So you notice that the first couple presentations that we did very much were intended to be a little more generic, like not specifically targeting couples just because, we're in more of a mixed group. But for this one, this really is targeting couples in particular. So a quick book recommendation I would have for everybody. There's a book called Created for Connection. This is by Sue Johnson and Kenneth Sandifer. There's a non-Christian version of this that's called Hold Me Tight, but both of them have the same information. Just this one also adds elements in there for Christian couples. And so I strongly recommend this book. It's a very good one. Today, as we're going through, we are specifically just going to be focusing on the first step in this process, right? So there's no way that I'll be able to walk everybody through the entirety of a program in 1 hour. But we can get a good label on what is happening in our conversations with each other and how to begin to shift these conversations. Now, for those of you who are not married and maybe are looking to be or just maybe have close relationships, this still will help because these patterns of communication that happen within the couple, to a lesser degree, can happen also in other close relationships. So I think you can still find some benefit, but this one is largely targeting couples. All right, so does everybody have the handout now? Anybody still missing it? Or okay, all right, so we're all good there. All right, so before we get into this, as Pastor Paul just alluded to, I want to have just a word of prayer with you, just because there's a good amount of information, but I want to make sure that we leave time for Q&A. So this one will actually be a little bit shorter than our other presentations so far, but that's intentional so I can make sure that I'm answering questions that are more directly related to what each person might individually need. We have a smaller group, so this actually allows me to be able to answer more questions. So with that being said, let's go ahead and just have one more word of prayer, and then we will get started. Our Father in heaven, we thank you so much for the privilege of being able to come before you in prayer and to have this time where you can instruct us on how to be better spouses one to another, to have more clear and effective communication, but not just for the purpose of having fancier words to say, Lord, but having hearts that are able to meet the needs of the other, Lord, and to have our needs met as well, Lord. I pray that you would allow marriage to have its rightful place once more, Lord. It's a beautiful institution that was given to us before sin was in the world, Lord. You gave us this wonderful institution where we can experience love between one another and have some hint of how much you love us, Lord. For indeed, Christ is the husband to his church, Lord. And so I pray that as we hear this message today, it would draw us closer to you and to each other. I pray in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, so as we've been talking about attachment, that's been the framework in which this Creative for Connection program is really based on that particular theory of attachment. I wanted to talk a little bit about love. So now that we are a little bit smaller here, I want to ask a question. When you hear the word love, what do you believe the definition of love is? Just throw out some words. Like when you think of love, what is love to you? And it could be a sentence, but like, what is love to you? Connection, and I heard comfort. Comfort. Unselfishness, caring. All right, anyone else? Service. Yes, definitely compassion. All right. So, yeah. Reaching out, yes, definitely. There is that reaching out that happens with love. Love compels us to move towards someone. Now, all of these words that you're using, they're all relational. And this makes it very clear that if God, like we know in 1 John 4, it says that God is love. Now, you'll notice that none of those things, love itself is something that does not make sense unless there's someone to love. Right? Like love just can't happen. It's not like rocks. Like rocks don't require people to exist. They can just be there. But love requires there be a person capable of experiencing it, someone who's capable of sharing it. I'm just going to share with you some interesting facts about love and how it has an effect on us. So some of the early experiments that were done, I think I shared last night about how in the early hospital settings, I think it was all the way up to the 1960s, when children were sick, their parents were supposed to drop them off and not be with them in the hospitals. Which now, I mean, if you just think about something like that now, I mean, I don't know if you can imagine taking your 2-year-old who's like sick to the hospital and say, here, we're going to drop you off and you're going to be here with strangers and get poked and prodded and all that stuff, and we'll come back in a couple of days or a couple of weeks and just see how you're doing. Anybody want to drop your 2-year-old off in that kind of situation? But the philosophy at that time was that love was something that was either making people weak or something that was a sign of immaturity. People who needed love were weak. Well, since that time, there's been some research that I don't even know if it should have been done. I think common sense would kind of tell us that, you know, if your child is screaming and crying and just completely distraught, that that's not going to support healing. But nevertheless, sometimes it takes us a while to realize we don't know what we're talking about. But after that time period, they actually have done some research that shows how important love really is. A few instances of research I wanted to share with you is, first of all, there was a film that was produced by James Robertson. It was called A 2-Year-Old Who Goes to the Hospital. And in this particular film, it documents how this child was dropped off at the hospital. This child is like screaming and crying and wants her parents. And after about 2 or 3 days, she's just like despondent. She's just like staring off into space and just not reacting. And by the time her parents come there, she just kind of glossed over and staring out into space. Now, this raised a lot of ruckus during that time, to the point that instead of the people responding to it, because he sent it to like the Committee for Physicians and all these things, instead of responding to it, what they did instead is they dismissed it as a fraud. And so there was like this actual resistance to believing that this information could be real. It was actually rejected as a fraudulent film. Following that, though, there were a few other discoveries that would be yet to be made. Having close ties with people turns out to be extremely vital. Lewis Hockley, who's at the Center of Cognitive and Social Neuroscience, stated that loneliness raises blood pressure to the point where the risk of heart attack and stroke is doubled. Doubles the risk of heart attack and stroke from loneliness, just from that one factor. Now, COVID and all this isolation that people had to experience actually had some pretty detrimental impacts on people. I've seen more young people coming in for therapy and counseling, and when I ask them, usually one of the things you want to ask is, when did something start? You know, I'm sure that people who work in the medical field, same thing. You want to know the onset, when these symptoms first started to show up, and many people, both in couples and children and families and adolescents, are tracing the time where this stress got worse for them back to COVID. When they did not have social connections, when they were left in isolation, these things actually had negative effects. Sorry, this thing keeps rubbing up his face. The second thing that they learned, so loneliness is a huge factor. The second thing that they learned was that emotional isolation, this is from James House from the University of Michigan. He said that emotional isolation is a more dangerous health risk than smoking or high blood pressure. That is incredible. Now, you might be wondering what this has to do with couples, but what they also found is that when a couple is experiencing distress, it has the same impact as being lonely. Like, it actually has a similar impact on the health. In fact, they did some interesting experiments on this one in particular. It says distress in a relationship has negative effects. When they took blood samples from newlyweds, they noticed that after they had a spat or a fight, they had higher levels of stress hormones, and their immune system was more depressed. That is, their immune system was not working as well. And after a single fight, their immune system can stay in this depressed state for over 24 hours from one fight. Now, if you keep having fight every day, guess what happens to your immune system? It stays in this depressed state, and then you get sick more often. Now, you probably have heard some of that research that people who have close relationships have longer lifespans than people who do not have those close, intimate relationships. But this is part of the reason why, is because it's not just like having another person there, but when we don't have a happy relationship with somebody, it's literally affecting our bodies. And so just to piece all this together, I want to share with you that love is not like frosting on the cake or like this side ingredient or something that you pretty up life with. It's an essential ingredient. Like, it's not something we can actually do without. We are designed for human connection. Like, love and bonds and relationship are essential. Now, I hope this scientific stuff is interesting to you. Y'all want to hear one more that they did? Well, actually, two more little experiments that they did, just trying to see what love does. Listen to this one. It said that when these couples were there, these newlyweds, when they were observing them and whenever they'd have arguments, they actually did an experiment where they took a little vacuum and put it on the skin of like the spouses, and they created little blisters on them. And then they allowed them to have an argument or a fight. And what they found was that for those who were having these arguments and fights, the blisters healed far more slowly. And so even injuries they're not recovering from as quickly as a result of something that is purely emotional. Emotions are real things. One last one that I'll share with you is they did an experiment with couples where they had these ladies who were kind of hooked into these chairs, and then they had this little metal ring that would go around their ankle, and then they just deliver a little shock to them. This sounds like really barbaric, but it was like a buzz, and it probably still is barbaric even if they put it in a scientific garb. But what they did is the lady would be watching in the fMRI scanner, and they'd watch, and whenever they saw an X, that meant nothing would happen. But whenever they saw a circle, there was a 25% chance that they'd be shocked. Now, that 25% is just to drive people crazy, because that means sometimes you'll get shocked. And so you could literally watch what would happen in the body, and the stress would just spike every time they saw that little O, because they didn't know, is this the one that's going to get me? And so they had them rate the amount of physical pain they experienced as a result of getting the shocks. Then, in the second round of experiments, they had the person sit and hold hands with the stranger. And what they observed is when they held hands with the stranger, that their rating of pain decreased. Then they had them hold hands with their spouse. And this is where the results got even more interesting. If they were happily married to their spouses, then when they were shocked, they reported feeling almost no pain. When they were in an unhappy relationship, it hurt just as bad as if they were alone. And so even with just some straightforward evidence, it seems that the protective factors that come from relationships only work if we have a meaningful connection with one another. All right, everybody relatively persuaded love's important? Yes? And a happy relationship is better than just one that exists? I know we hear things like love is a principle, but don't think that just because love is a principle, it doesn't have feelings, man. The feeling part is actually quite important. So what we're going to be talking about today is one of the cycles that can get us caught in this pattern of distancing ourselves and getting in these constant conflicts without seeming resolution. So we are designed for connection. The scripture that's put up here from Psalm 36 and verse 7 says, "How priceless is your unfailing love, O God. People take refuge in the shadow of your wings." We are designed to have these kinds of relationships. So the goals for this particular program that we're just going to be looking at the introduction to is to get to a place we can understand love, understand emotions and needs, control some of these negative dances, shape a positive loving bond, and grasp how bonding, science, and scripture sing the same song, a song about the possibility of living in love. So this will be the objective. Now, just as a side note, one of the things I am looking forward to doing in the future is actually just putting on a full version of this. And if that'd be something people would be interested in, please just let me know. In this particular one, I would not have to be in the capacity as working as like a therapist, but just somebody who's facilitating the program. But anyway, we have all the materials for that. But if it's something that people would be interested in getting further into, please do let me know, because interest kind of makes it more worthwhile to put it on in the first place. All right, so some of the key concepts. So the first question is, I was asking earlier today, like, what is love? Is love just about sex? Is it just sentiment? Is it fever, delusion, addiction, friendship? If you look into a lot of the popular science, it describes it in many of these terms. That it's something that just burns hot and heavy in the beginning when we're just attracted to each other. But as it turns out, the most satisfying parts of a marriage are actually not just the intensity in the beginning, although that is extremely important. It's actually the long-term romance that has the longest impact on the health and on the overall happiness and well-being of each person. I also believe that love is logical. Now, this one does use some language that I wouldn't necessarily use, but this is the program here. It talks about a mammalian survival code. So human beings are obviously not the only ones that experience love. You can see animals also nurture each other. But I believe that there is a deeper sense in which God has designed us to be able to experience that. And as we were hearing earlier today, it's like a neural duet. When people are in love with each other and really making those connections, your brains and your bodies actually do line up and sync with each other. So what I'm going to be doing here is we're going to be focusing on the negative cycle. So I'm going to kind of just skip over to specifically what happens when people get caught in this negative dance. Now, I think everybody said you have this R questionnaire here, the ARE questionnaire. On this one, it asks you questions that I would like you just to take a look at. So if you have that one, just take a look at this one here. So one of the first questions that it asks on here is your partner accessible to you? That accessibility is so important. If we don't feel accessible to one another, then that oftentimes can be the beginning of what keeps a conflict entrenched. So is your partner accessible to you? Now, even if you don't score very highly on this, it's not hopeless because there are ways to get unstuck. But it says things like, I can get my partner's attention easily. My partner is easy to connect with emotionally. My partner shows me that I come first with him or her. And so you can take a look at those. But these are really important questions to go over. The second thing here is that if you're just looking at the questions, you can actually see what some of the solutions are. Like your goal should be to make the answer to every one of those questions for your spouse, yes. So now everybody can just leave. Now you're all done. So if you can actually turn all the questions like that to yes, honestly, it doesn't even matter what the content of your discussion is. If you remain in a space where you are accessible, responsive, and engaged, notice none of them say, does your partner agree with you? Because it's not necessary in order to have a happy relationship. Now, there are like big value things you probably want to have agreement on, but it's not necessary that in every particular you agree on everything. So I really encourage you to take a look at that and then really check out where are you at with that. Now, notice that it's asking the other person's perception of you. So you can't be the only one that says yes. You want your partner to be able to say that that's true about you and not you just to say that's true about yourself, because I think we'd all give ourselves high grades, maybe. All right. So these R questions are often hidden in content issues. So we must pinpoint what makes for secure bonding and use what secure couples do as a guide. So one of the things that has helped to guide this particular therapy is watching people who were considered like the masters, the people who had relationships that were actually healthy and were productive. Now let me see if I can jump over here to just a few of these. So the first one that is listed here is finding these demon dialogues. Now, some of you have probably realized that when you have a disagreement, it almost doesn't matter the specifics of what you're disagreeing about because the conversation follows the exact same tone. Has anybody ever noticed before? We could be arguing about the laundry or about the dishes or about the bills, but it always gets stuck on the same point. You don't really listen to me. You're not really engaged in this conversation. How come you never talk to me? Why do you always have to be so negative? Why do you got to be so dramatic about everything? It's the exact same conversation with different content. Now, when I grew up, I noticed that a lot of people would listen. I noticed that a lot of pop music kind of had the same keys and tones to it. Y'all noticed that before? It's like the same beat. There's actually this silly video where you can find this dancing Spider-Man. And you can literally let this dancing Spider-Man show up on your screen, and you can play any song, and he will eventually sync up with the music that he's supposed to be listening to, especially if it's things like pop music. That doesn't quite work with more complicated music than that, but like most of the time, pop music will follow such a formula that you could do one dance, and it works for all the songs. And I submit to you that oftentimes will happen even in conversations. It's like it's different words, but the same tune. Now, one of the things they found with couples therapy is that when couples therapists taught people communication skills, that would tend to kind of turn down the volume of the music. Like if I can start the conversation slowly and say, okay, now I'll hold the feather and then you talk, I talk and then you hold the feather and then you talk, right? Which is helpful to stop cutting each other off, right? But it's a little bit like turning the music down, okay? But if you turn the music down, has the song changed? No, you can adjust the volume all you want, but if it's the same song, what oftentimes will happen is people will have the same discussions more quietly, and then they quietly still divorce each other, because that's just not how you get to the bottom of it. So let's take a look at some of these demon dialogues that can come up. I don't know if you'll be able to see it on the slide here, but I have it written down on my side, so I'm going to see if I can jump over to this with you. All right, so this demon dialogue. So if you actually look at the first handout here, this first one says in-class exercise session 1, and it says recognizing demon dialogue. So if you want to just take a look at this one here, this one actually begins to map out the types of demon dialogues that can come up. I think I have one more up here. Okay. All right. Do we need another one? Okay. All right. There you are. You're welcome. Yeah, no problem. Okay. All right, so on this one, there are several types of demon dialogues that can actually come up in a couple. And I don't know if you'll be able to see it up here, but I'll see if I can kind of walk you through it a bit. So the first kind of demon dialogue that can come up is one that's called find the bad guy. Now, in the find the bad guy type of demon dialogue, you'll hear a typical kind of response, a call and response from both of the partners. The first person may say, you know, how come you always just leave the dishes undone? And they're like, well, no, I didn't leave the dishes undone. It's actually because I was really busy. And actually the reason I didn't do the dishes is because you asked me to go and clean out the garage. And so I was actually out there. Now, if you wouldn't ask me to do so many things, then none of this stuff would go wrong in the first place. And it's back and forth, right? It's the whole point of the fight is trying to find out whose fault it is that all this stuff happened. Now, I want you just to think about this for a second. Even if you were successful in finding out who the bad guy is, what is it exactly that you've won? Like, if you win the fight and it turns out it's the other person's fault, what exactly have you won? Now, most of the time we don't think about that because we're too busy playing defense. But what happens a lot of the times is that even if it was the other person's fault, even if they are the bad guy, what does that say about your relationship? That means you just married a bad guy. That's not particularly helpful, and I don't think anybody actually wants to come to that conclusion, but we can get so lost in the conflict that we forget that there's a reason why we're trying to have the conversation in the first place. But to find the bad guy is one of these dances that can happen. Oftentimes, once couples get to this place, there's usually something underneath that is getting in the way of them being able to make this connection. We get too focused on the idea that if you're thinking about a dance of whether or not you stepped on my foot, then whether or not we're doing the same kind of dance. Now, when I was younger, I used to try my hand at breakdancing. Anybody else here ever do any breakdancing stuff, or is that no, I'm the only one, all right. I thought I was good at it anyway. So if one person is trying to breakdance and the other person is trying to like salsa, are they gonna have problems in their dancing? Yes, and you know why? First of all, it's different kinds of music. Secondly, the dance moves are very, very different. Salsa is like a very intimate one where you both have to coordinate with each other. And breakdancing is actually a solo endeavor, right? And so if I'm trying to solo dance, while you're trying to dance with somebody, then we are going to run into each other very frequently. And this oftentimes, again, will happen in couples. Because one person in the relationship can tend to be very independent, just wants to do things on their own, and wants their spouse to just do things on their own. The other person likes to work together. And if the individual who likes to do things on their own is breakdancing while the other person is trying to salsa, guess what's going to happen? Like lots of damage. Now, how do you get through this? Well, the solutions for all of them are going to be pretty much the same, but one of the first things that we want to be able to do is to stay in the present. Stay in the present. So if you have a pen, you want to write these things down, this is one of the first steps that you want to be able to do to keep an argument from going in the same old circles is stay in the present. Oftentimes when we are caught in like any one of these demon dialogues, the way that you can win a fight is even if I'm wrong, like I should have done the dishes, all I have to do is bring up something from the past where you were more wrong than I was. None of y'all ever done that before, have you? Yes. And sometimes as kids, we do this with our parents. It's like, you know, well, you didn't do your homework. It's like, well, you never took me to the game, and so da-da-da. It's like, what does that have to do but it helps us feel a little better about ourselves. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to break that down and stay in the present. But that can feel really scary because if I stay in the present, then I don't have this stuff from the past that I can arm myself with that helps me to be right. And I want to submit to you that that's not really the point of the discussion. One of the things I try to tell couples when I work with them is, don't worry about winning the argument. Worry about winning the person. Okay? So if you've successfully defended yourself by bringing up all this stuff from the past, you have not successfully won the person. But if your goal is to win the person, then staying in the present is really the only way to get there. So then my wife comes to me and says, David, you didn't do the dishes. Now I can say, I'm sorry, but if I've been using that line for a long time and she's just like, I'm tired of sorry, I want to see actions, then that's not really going to work. So one of the things I might want to do is venture a question, and I'm not going to ask it in a snarky way. What I'm going to say is, dear, how come this is bothering you so much? Because I did forget, it wasn't on purpose, but why is this bothering you so much? Now, immediately by asking that question, I'm no longer in a defensive place. I'm actually attuning to her. I want to find out what in the world is going on and why is this bothering her so much. And you know what? Sometimes it'll turn out that the reason that's bothering her isn't because dishes are hard to do. It's probably bothering her because she's had a really stressful day. Incidentally, I do the dishes. Like, I really do. But I'm just using that because everybody knows about dishes. And so, but if I ask her that, now I get to actually learn about what's happening in her day. I get to find out why she's feeling so stressed out. And a lot of times we stop talking about dishes and I'm just there for her. And sometimes, if I'm really savvy about it, I still don't have to do the dishes at the end because I've talked to her. I'm just kidding. No, don't do that. But you can actually stay present in that conversation and make sure that we've actually had a real connection. The second thing is to recognize that because this is a cycle, there is no starting point on a circle, right? So you can point anywhere on the circle, but I guarantee all you have to do is trace it back a little further, and you can always make the other person the bad guy because at some point they were involved in the process. But you know why that's not surprising? It's because you all are in a relationship, right? So if you're always engaging with each other, all you have to do is figure out what just happened, and then that'll be that person's fault, and they figure out what happened before that, and then it's their fault. So, wife says, you didn't do the dishes? I say, yeah, but last night, you didn't help put the kids down. It's like, well, no, I didn't put the kids down, but that's because you came home later than you were supposed to. And that's like, well, I came home later than I was supposed to because you spent more money than you were supposed to. And then we just keep going backwards until we're like, well, this is pointless. But it's pointless because we're no longer talking about what actually matters. All right, so this makes sense to everybody? Is it helpful for me to give you these little illustrations? Because I can think in really technical terms, but I'd like for you all to really be able to see where you're at in this dance. So in a circle, there is no one to blame. It's just the cycle's fault, which is one of my first homework assignments for you all and for the people that I see, is begin to name the cycle, because it's not your partner's fault, but it is the music we're listening to. So let's figure out this music. So now my wife can be like, well, David, why do you get so defensive when I bring up the idea that you didn't do the dishes? And if I'm honest with myself, it's like, well, because every time you bring that up, it just makes it sound like you don't appreciate anything I do. Well, feeling unappreciated, is that a problem we can solve? Well, I think you can. Like, if you express appreciation to the person and you take time to actually acknowledge that they're there for you, then you start to drop a lot of the defensiveness. So find out what's going on underneath it. So you stay present. You don't try to look at who's at fault for starting this cycle, but you recognize that it's a circle. Now, there's a second kind of dance, and those are the first two tips for that one. There's a second kind of dance, and this is probably the most difficult one. This is what is called the protest polka. And it's so called because there are two different ways to protest. I mean, there's probably more than two, but there are the two main ways to protest. One of them is your active vocal protest. Like, I've had enough of this, and I'm not tolerating it anymore. Like, it's that. Like, enough is enough. And so you hold up the sign and say, I'm not going to deal with this anymore. I'm not going to be in a situation where no one pays attention to me and cares about my feelings. So I raise the banner high and make sure that everybody knows that I'm upset about this thing and I'm not putting up with it anymore, right? All right, so maybe you've seen this or you've experienced this before, but this is one side of the protest. It's that demand that you start making changes. Then there's the passive protest. And maybe you all who have kids have seen this before, like where your kids do the dead weight thing. And a kid can go from weighing 20 pounds to like 120 pounds. And it's just like this incredible thing. And they just flop and they move in such a way. And it's just like trying to grab, like heavy Jell-O. It doesn't work. And they just keep sliding through. It's really incredible how children can do this. And this is like the passive side of it. This is like the dead weight protest. Now, in a conversation, the way that this shows up is that while the first person is like raising the banner and doing all this other stuff, the person who has the dead weight one kind of just stares off. It's like, here we go. And they just stare at the wall. And while they're staring at the wall, the person over there is like, see, you don't even care about me. You don't listen to me. And then they shake their head even more. It's like, why are you even shaking your head? You're not even paying attention, blah, blah, blah. And they're just staring off into space. Now, what often happens is the person over here who's protesting thinks that this person who's staring at the wall is just not feeling anything. However, research that has been gone out there, John Gottman again, being at one of the forefronts of this, found that when they had these people hooked up to heart monitors and all these other pieces, the person who is stonewalling and staring off into space is actually more distressed than the person who's yelling. Now, that might come as a surprise to some of you all, but what it tells me is that both people are engaging in something because it feels like there's like a survival threat going on. So, you've heard of fight and flight, all right? Now, there's another F that comes in there. Anybody know what it is? It's another survival response. Deer do it. Freeze, right? Now, if you took a deer who's like traipsing along, and we see this all the time, my boys like to scare the deer around there because they come, kind of just, marching in, and the boys are like, they try to like sneak up on them. It's really strange. You don't have to teach boys to be predators. I'm sure girls maybe do it too, but you don't have to teach these guys at all. They just kind of like crouch down, and they run out there and chase the deer, but like right before that, you see this like stiffening up, and they're looking. Now, does anybody think that this deer who's just staring like this is calm? That's not calm. That's terror. This thing is trying to make sure that, okay, if I run, if this thing is faster than me, then I'm going to get eaten. But if I stay still, maybe they'll stop attacking. And this is exactly what's going on in the fight. The reason the person stops talking and starts staring is because they think if maybe they just stay still, maybe he won't notice or she won't notice, and they'll just give up. But inside, this person feels attacked and beat up. And so they're just trying to do something to get away from what's so painful. Now, you can see why these dances would really be hard to manage, right? Because the person who's over there protesting is also dying inside because it's just like, how come I don't have anybody here to talk to? I feel like I'm totally alone. It feels like if I didn't work on this marriage, nobody would. It's like they are freaking out because it's like nobody's here with me. But the more they're freaking out about this, the more the person who's staring off into space feels overwhelmed and flooded and is trying to escape. And so it creates this really vicious cycle. Now, this one is particularly difficult because one of the things that they found is that when they would watch couples who go into this dance, they said that I think it was something like 4/5 of the marriages where they saw this happening with newlyweds would be ended within 5 years from this particular dance and that happens. And part of the reason for that is because it is extremely challenging to navigate. Now, while it's hard to navigate, I would say it's extremely hard to navigate on your own. If you have somebody, and if you all are working through something like this, like if you decided you wanted to get this book and you wanted to work through something like this, it actually helps you to navigate out of these things. Or if you talk with a professional, they can really walk you through this. But I do want to share with you all some tips for how you walk out of this. So, one of the first things that I will talk to people about when I see this kind of protest polka is exactly what I was sharing with you, is helping them to stop protesting for a second and start talking about what's happening inside. Like, why are you staring off into space? Now, the first thing you're probably going to hear is, for the person who's staring off, or they're saying, oh, here we go again. Like, that's usually the comment that comes out. Here we go again. You're going to tell me about all the ways that I messed up, and da-da-da-da-da. And okay, and it's like, all right, so what's going on with this here we go again? Why does that bother you so much? Well, it's like, once we go into this here we go again cycle, I already know that nothing that I do is going to make a difference. Now, I want you to notice this. If you conclude that nothing you can do is going to make a difference, then what are you going to do? Nothing. And guess what happens when you do nothing? Nothing. Y'all are really good at this. Y'all must have taken this class before. When you do nothing, nothing changes. But that is an assumption. Now, granted, the person has tried some things before, but the last few things that they tried, they didn't work, mostly because instead of trying to address and connect with the person, they simply either tried to problem solve or diminish. Like, it's not that big a deal, let things cool off, wait till tomorrow. one of the things that, one of the analogies that I used before was kind of like this idea of letting things drift down the river. I remember I was talking with somebody who has more of that tendency to kind of shut down and stare off into space. And they said, well, you know, I'm kind of somebody who just kind of goes with the flow. And I said, okay, I can get with that. That makes sense. Go with the flow. Like, you know, just, it sounds so smooth. Go with the flow. Like, you know, and you run into something, hey, no big deal. No big deal. That rock is over. We can just move on. Now, the problem is, I said, well, let's just imagine, I like to go with the flow because I think that's super helpful to get through some things. But let's just imagine that you're going with the flow, but the thing you're flowing in is a circle. And you keep running into this rock, and it really hurts. And you're like, hey, man, just go with the flow. Go with the flow. You don't have to remember the past. Now, what is likely going to happen if you keep going with the flow and you keep hitting the same object over and over again? What's not happening for you? You're not learning anything. Did you know did you know that that's the entire purpose of memory, is to learn? You have a memory so that when you've been through something, you know how to navigate it next time. So if you go too far with the flow, then the chances of you actually learning from the last time we had this conflict goes down to almost zero. So I said, hey, I don't think you like getting hurt, so let's figure out if there's something that keeps happening that's a pattern here, because you notice that something happens, you get upset, she gets upset, let's figure out what's going to actually help you. And so I go through a series of questions with them, which I'll go over with you in just a moment. Now, let me give you the last demon dialogue, and then we're going to go through these points, and then from there, I'm really going to just leave it open for some Q&A. All right, so the third type of demon dialogue that comes up is what's called the freeze and flee. Now, freeze and flee is, as you can probably hear, it's like the one person who kind of stares off and the other person who runs away. Now, with that kind of response, there's no engagement. So oftentimes, by the time you see this kind of couple, the way that they will show up is that they'll just be quiet. Nobody has anything to protest because nobody's saying what they want, and so it just stays silent. Now, these particular couples don't tend to last very long, and sometimes this freeze-flee couple that has this cycle of engagement tends to be the folks who were in this protest polka and now have dropped into the stage of where the person who does a lot of the pursuing and a lot of the active protest has just given up. When that happens, incidentally, when the pursuer stops pursuing, when the person who protests stops protesting, that tends to be like one of the biggest warning signals that we've kind of hit. We've kind of hit a rock bottom here, and we definitely need help. It's not over, but that's definitely a large signal that we need to be able to do something. So when these couples come in, you ask them like how they're doing. It's like, oh, we're okay. And I remember I worked with a particular couple like this that came in. I said, hey, what do you guys want to work on? It's like, well, we're really not that happy. And I'm like, okay, cool. Well, how often do you argue? It's like, oh, we never argue. We're actually pretty good about that. It's like, oh, so then what's the problem? It's like, well, I don't know. When I asked, well, like, how do you all do with household duties? Oh, yeah, we got that worked out. You know, she does this, I do that. Okay, how are you doing with finances? Like, actually, we agree on that. Like, we actually made a lot of really good investments together. We're like great business partners. And I go down the list, and like, they're really good partners at a lot of stuff. But then when I come down to like, well, how do you all do as far as connection? Because it's like 3 different ways for people to be able to connect on the intimate level. Emotionally, they can connect emotionally, they can connect through affection, that's just like with basic physical touch, and then there's also the intimacy part of the relationship. And it was there where the problems became very apparent. And they just said, we don't. I said, well, that could be the issue. And so the problems in these particular ones is they have to be able to re-engage. And so when I ask them questions like, well, when's the last time you all really had a meaningful connection like that, a really deep connection? And they said, like, I don't know, it's been like 2 or 3 years. I was like, wow, man, 2 or 3 years, that's a long time. That's a long time. By anyone's measure, that's a long time to not have had any close connections with each other, to not have any intimacy in the relationship for that long. And I asked, well, do you still want that? And they're like, well, yeah, I guess, but I just, you know, I don't want to get in a fight about it. I don't want us to have any arguments about it, so we just kind of agreed to just let it go. Now, when I individually talked to both of these people and I asked them what kind of personal mental health symptoms they were experiencing, one of them had like really high anxiety and the other one was extremely depressed. And that's not surprising, because if you're looking at fleeing and freezing, the person who's frozen all the time is very likely to be depressed. And the person who's running away all the time is likely to be anxious, because that's what anxiety does, is it makes you run. And the freezing response makes you, on a physiological level, depressed. All right, everybody following this so far? And so when I was working with them, a lot of what had to happen is I had to reactivate the willingness to take risks. which for that particular communication pattern, the big thing I work with them on is re-engaging and taking the risk. It's a risky thing to reach out to somebody and tell them that you want them, that you desire to have a really meaningful connection with them. But if you don't take those risks, the fire goes out. I'm not suggesting we should be getting in fights, but I definitely believe we have to be able to say something about the needs that we have. So, like it says there on number 5, if each reach, risk, respond isn't happening, we have a habitual coping strategy such as angry blaming. These are often learned in early relationships. And if we have not gone to the angry blaming, then we can get into this freeze response. So the goals here are to really be able to stop spiraling in insecurity. So for that conversation number 1 that you see there, the goal there is to actually be able to get to the space. Now, if you just take a look at number 1, it says, when things are going right between us, I find that I tend to move towards you by doing what? When things are not going right between us, I tend to move towards you by doing what? Now, I just want you to take a look at that sheet there and just see if you can find anything on there that kind of matches with what your pattern might be. This is the conversation 1. So this is the one that says session 1, conversation 1 at the top. So as you're going through that, just take a look at that and just notice, like, what is it that you tend to do when you notice things are not going well? Do you tend more towards complaining? Do you become critical? Do you begin yelling? Do you tell how to improve? Do you blow up? Do you insist on making your point even if you get pushy? Expressing frustration, disapproval? Do you pursue? Do you make threats? Is it prodding? How do you deal with it? If you move away, how do you do that? Do you try to zone out? Do you try to stay calm and reason? Do you start shutting down? Look at those things there and start to map it out. Towards the end of this, you will actually see an opportunity at the bottom to really begin to map out what is your pattern in your relationship. So once you jump all the way down to the bottom, once you've circled these, you want to go through and kind of circle some of those verbs and see if you can fill in the blanks. So check this out. At the very bottom, it says, the more I blank, the more you blank. And then the more I blank, till we're caught in our blank. So in that last blank, you want to find out what is that cycle that you have there. So we looked at 3 of them. The first one there was to find the bad guy. So do you both end up pointing fingers and finding blame in each other? The second one we looked at was that protest polka. Do you find one person tends to withdraw and the other person tends to try to pursue? Or do you find yourself in the third one where we just agree to disagree and then just not engage in the conversation at all? How do you find yourself dealing with these dialogues? All right. So the second thing here is after you found those dialogues, so after you have a chance to fill that out, and this is really going to be homework, not something that we'll do right here, look at which one of those are and begin to find the ability to label them. Now I want to see if I put in here with these dialogues whether or not there's a few steps that it puts up here. So again, with the exercise here, you want to ask yourself, when you feel disconnected, what is your default option? What is your main move? And the second question you want to be able to ask is, where did you learn that move from? Right? Like, whatever moves that we do in a relationship, these usually existed before we got into the relationship we're in now. Right? Like, we didn't just wake up one day and find ourselves being averse to really intense conflict, or find ourselves feeling like we're alone and people don't want to be around us, so that someone doesn't love me as much as I love them. Where did that originally come from? Then, the second question on there is, how do you find yourself pulling your partner into the spiral? And maybe trigger that primal panic in them. What is it that you're doing on your side? All right. So typically in that pursue or withdrawal, this is part of that protest polka. I want you to see some of the dialogue that's very common with that. Pursuers will tend to say things like, I'm dying here, I'm shut out, my feelings don't matter, it's lonelier than living alone by myself, I feel dismissed, I get no response, I'm hammering on the door, I yell to get a response, any response. We're roommates, I don't matter to you. That tends to be the dialogue of the pursuer. On the second side of it, the withdrawers tend to say things like, I never get it right, I can't please you, I give up, I space out, it's best to avoid a fight, try to keep things calm, I feel like I'm failing here, like I'm paralyzed, there's no point, and then I go behind my wall, I try to fix it, but it doesn't work, I numb out. These are the dialogues that tend to happen with people who are on the pursue or withdraw path. So with that, like the last demon dialogue that we were talking about before, again, there's that mutual withdrawal, there's that no risk piece. Oftentimes the aftermath is a chronic protest. It's often the the aftermath of a chronic protest polka. There's hopelessness, there's no sex, there's no touch. People feel like strangers. There's an icy emptiness and it feels depressing. It's kind of that prelude to detachment. All right. So the one I want to be able to share with you, because this is going to be the last slide there, these are ones that I encourage you just to take a few notes on, and then like I said, I'll take some Q&A at the very end here. The first piece is, if you want to jot down this question, it's one that I really recommend going through here. The first one is, when we are not getting along, I often react by. And at the conclusion of that, what you'd want to be able to do is name what is that behavior that I engage in when we're not getting along, right? So that's the first question that you want to be able to answer there. The second question, this is not going to be on your notes, so again, if you want to jot it down, the second question that you want to be able to ask is, my partner reacts by what? So when we're not getting along, how does my partner react? How do they tend to respond when we're not getting along? The third one here is, when my partner reacts this way, I often feel. So after we've gotten past the behaviors, which is a lot of times where most discussions get stuck, we want to find out what is that emotion that occurs. Like, what is that feeling that underlies it? The fourth one here is that when I feel this way, I see myself as. So that when I feel this way, I see myself as. So if I give a quick example of this, if I'm just using kind of a sample couple here, they may have a few answers to this. So in the first one, the first person might say, I often react by bringing up the fact that, you know, we continue to keep fighting about the same things. I don't ever really get to see you. You don't seem to care about me. So they respond by becoming critical maybe, or just like picking or poking or whatever you want to call it. The second person says, well, I react by just trying to calm things down or shutting down or turning away. Now, when they look at each other's responses, they'll both usually will be able to label pretty accurately what they see the other person doing. But where the conversation tends to get the most interesting is when we get down to the feeling. So as I said before, the person who's protesting will oftentimes say that I feel frustrated, I feel blocked out, I feel angry. But when they start to get underneath those feelings of anger and frustration, again, are coming from a deep sense of, I just feel alone. I don't feel like you care about where I'm coming from. And the other person says, well, I feel like nothing I do matters to you, and so I feel unimportant to you. Once we get to that place, I'll ask them, how do you see yourself in the relationship? And usually that's where people will begin to look at they'll begin to look at what their role and position is. Like when the first person says that I don't feel important, I feel like I'm small, I feel like I'm back in this situation where no one cares about my needs, right? And so as you go through these questions, each one of these will allow you to get to the underlying need. Because when I'm in this place where I feel like I'm all alone and no one cares about me, the needs become very simple and they don't have to do with dishes anymore. It just might be, I just need you to be able to tell me that you actually appreciate me, that what I do really matters. I need you to be able to tell me that you're still attracted to me, that you still love me, that I'm still somebody that you want to be close to. Once couples get down here, I can tell you every single time they go from arguing and angry to actually just patiently and closely listening to each other and beginning to develop those connections and bonds. So those are the 3 demon dialogues, and these are some basic strategies that help you to begin to break out of these dialogues, and these are some good questions that you can ask yourself and each other to identify how these demon dialogues can come up for you. All right, so I'll stop here and maybe just stop here and pause for some questions, because I think some people have questions, and because this is a larger context, if this was a smaller group, I'd actually be asking you all, like, hey, what do you notice happens with you? But I also want to be mindful of not putting folks on the spot. So at this point in there, as we're looking at these different kinds of dialogues that can happen, these constant cycles people can get caught up in, I want to find out, are there any questions that you all might have, or any questions that maybe I can throw out there based on what we've shared so far? All right. I've just been talking so solidly for 45 minutes. I don't know if anybody knows what to do with the silence there. All right. So any questions that come up around this, around how do we get unstuck when we get stuck in these patterns of dialogue, when we get caught in these same cycles and loops? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's an excellent question. So yes, if you know it didn't start with the relationship, how do you figure out where it came from? Okay, so there's some really key questions that I'll ask people. And I'll see if I can use a case example. So I have to process a little bit because I have to make sure I'm changing names, and so I'm not identifying actual people when I talk about this. Okay, so one of the examples that I use is I was talking with a woman who was having difficulty, like really kind of regulating herself. She would get super upset and frustrated, and would like go into this place where like she's just almost out of control and like almost impossible to reason with her and all these things. And so the husband would get really upset and be like, well, see, this is why I can't talk to her, because she's so out of control. And I said, okay. So we go down these questions like I'm asking that I wrote down here, and I ask, okay, what's going on for you? Well, I feel really upset and distressed. I feel like they don't really care about me. They're not here for me. I asked them, okay, have you ever felt like this before? And I said, yeah, I feel like this all the time in the relationship. I'm like, okay, that makes sense. Can you tell me what's really kind of happening in your body? What do you notice that your body wants to do? So the reason I bring it back to the body is you'll notice that all of your emotions include your physical person. Your emotions are actually designed to get your body moving in a very specific way. When I feel angry, it moves me towards aggression. When I feel afraid, it makes me want to run. There are specific things that every emotion does in your body. So I ask, what is going on in your body? And they said, I feel like really tight, like I just want to ball up and scream. And I said, okay, that's really specific. Can you help me understand if there's ever been any times in your life where you've had that same feeling where you just wanted to ball up and scream? And she said, yes. And I said, well, can you tell me about when that was? And she said, yes, because like every time I would hear my parents fighting and my mom just pleading for my dad to stay and to stop cheating on her and to stop going out and drinking and doing all these things, I would hear her just pleading with him, and I'd feel so bad for her, and I wanted her to stop trying to continuously put her in this situation where she was getting herself hurt. And as a kid, I could not stop her, and so I would just sit in my room and I would ball up, and I would just feel like screaming. I was like, okay, probably where that came from then. And so it starts to feel like you're back in that position again, like you're in the position that your mom was in, like pleading for the attention of somebody who doesn't want to be there for you. It's like, yeah. And it's like, well, did your husband do that? And it's like, no. But when you get those little signals that say he's not going to be there and you have to do all this chasing him and get him to pay attention to you, it feels like you're doing what your mom did. And suddenly the conversation changes. The man is sitting over there. He's like, oh, shoot, this is not my fault anymore, but I can actually see why this is hurting her so bad, because I don't want to feel like I'm putting her in the position where her mom was in before. And now he's turning and looking at her, and now he's starting to reassure her. I'm not going anywhere. He sees where her pain is coming from. She ain't crazy. This is just something that has carried over into a relationship. And so what I do is I ask what the feeling is. I ask them to pay really close attention to their bodies, because your body has a better way of explaining what's going on than your words do a lot of times. And as soon as you make that bodily connection, it's very easy to begin to connect. When's the last time you physically felt like doing what you're doing right now when you were younger? And it was very easy for it to go from like, oh, balling up tight and wanting to scream. I know exactly when I did that. So, probably a longer answer than you wanted, but hopefully still helpful. Yeah. All right, questions? Other thoughts, questions? Is this helpful for people to know what these conversations kind of look like? I know everybody kind of, it can be very private sometimes to talk about these things, but go ahead, yes. Mm-hmm. 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 Do you mean just like therapy as an option, or like when do you say like?
This isn't working.
Okay, yes. All right, yeah, so there are some times where like a couple is so stuck, and it's not even really about the stuckness, it's about the motivation piece. So I actually just had a session the other day with a couple where they said, right before we got on, I got to de-identify some details. There was like this really serious death in the family, and there was another serious death that was like less than a month ago, and then once the person got back, I just told them I want a divorce, and so I was like, oh my gosh. It's like 20 plus years of marriage, same fight over and over and over and over again, stuck, right? And so one of the things that I did with them is I said, listen, I'm not, as a therapist, and this is because like as a practitioner, I can't bring religion into things unless people ask for it. So I said, as a therapist here, I can't like tell you what you should and shouldn't do. But I do want to bring to your attention what still may be possible. And so oftentimes if somebody is caught in an endless cycle, a lot of what is keeping them there is because they're like married to their conclusions. Okay? And married to their conclusions. Right? So the person who had asked for a divorce, I asked them, okay, so why is that? Well, they said, well, I just believe, the person is never going to change. They're always going to do this. I can never satisfy them. I just know that this is how it's going to be. And what I said to them is like, okay, the first thing I want to share with you is that fears are not facts. You actually don't know what's possible until you've literally tried everything, and you know that no one has ever actually tried everything. Like, even when you hear people say they've tried everything, I can tell you right now, no, they didn't. Yeah, because I can just make something up. It's like, well, did you try arguing while riding a tricycle? It's like, ha, didn't see that one coming, did you? Pulled that one outside from the side. Anyway, so like, you probably actually haven't tried everything, but you are terrified that everything has been tried. And then what I ask is, why is that so terrifying to you? Well, because I don't want to perpetually be in a place where this person is just telling me over and over and over again that I don't want what they want. And oftentimes these things do come up around the intimate part of their relationships, and so sometimes that'll be it, and it's like, I don't think I can ever be that person. And I said, okay, so what makes you think that you can't ever be that person? So now what I'm doing here is I'm finding out what they're terrified about, and then I want to find out why they're terrified. And I know if they talk long enough, I will easily see a solution in here, and it won't take long before I find out that whatever they're terrified about is probably not correct. And so I'll just keep listening. Now, I'm not saying that because I don't think people are smart. That's not why I'm saying that. It's because I think there's something they're not seeing. And so what they'll do is they'll start talking about why they're terrified about this, and it's like, well, every time I've ever tried, it's never worked. And I said, okay. Now, if I'm talking about intimacy in particular, I'm just using this as one example, you could use many, then I'll say, okay, when is the last time you've actually been able to say what it is that you enjoy? Because it sounds to me like you've probably spent a lot of time trying to make the other person happy. Have you ever really expressed what makes you happy? And they said, well, not really. I'll bring it up once or twice, but when I do bring it up, they get really defensive and upset, and so I just close it down. And I say, okay, but is it possible that if they could really listen to you, if they could really hear you and know that you really have desires in that area, would that give you some sense that there might be something hopeful here? We're like, well, yeah, but I don't think they do it. And it's like, well, why don't you think they do it? It's because I don't think they care about how I feel. Well, let's check in with this. Excuse me. As you're listening to them talk about how important this part of the relationship is to them, at any point or at this point, have you ever not cared about how they felt? And the answer is almost always no, unless they're just trying to be belligerent. Because I know they cared at some point, that's why they got married. So I already know that that's just going to be a lie if they just tell me that, and I'll challenge them a little bit. Not in a rude way, but I'll definitely challenge people on that. But they'll say, no, actually it does matter to me. And I said, okay, so let me ask you a question. If they said yes, and they can give you what it is that would make you happy in this area, you're saying to me that you would actually feel like there's hope there. Yes, okay, great. And if you could have that, do you think you might find yourself more interested in the very thing that they keep pestering you about? And I was like, well, yeah, because I'd actually be a part of it. That'd be nice. It turns out that, when people are intimate, they both want to enjoy that. Isn't that weird? Maybe I'm just the only person thinking, okay. So no, it actually turns out it's not weird. It actually turns out that's actually quite common. And as it turns out, they said, well, no, if that was actually the case, then I might actually be more interested in having connections like this. And then this person's eyebrows over here goes up because like, oh my gosh, I just thought they just didn't care. And it's like, well, no, it's not that they don't care. They just actually want to be a part of what's going on, and they don't want to be used. Sometimes I'm not so straightforward, but I am a little bit straightforward sometimes. I just find like, I kind of cut through a lot of mess, save a little bit of time. But what I do is I confront what they are afraid of. I ask them why they're afraid of that. I ask them what makes them think that that fear is true. A lot of times once they begin to explain that, whatever they're using to justify why their fears are true, like this person will never change, they don't really care about me, and all those other things, are almost 99% of the time are false. And then by the end of the session, like what literally just happened this past Friday, they're wanting to come back and then they're going to try again, even though they were certain they were going to divorce. 100% certain, yeah.
It's a key ingredient that they're both there together and that they're both willing to talk. Because I feel like I've had so many times where I'm talking to a friend and they're sharing my heart and I'm like, you will be fine together. Like, as an outsider looking in, of course there's things in an intimate relationship, but I feel like, I feel bad saying, stay together when somebody's hurting, right? But at the same time, I feel like my obligation under God, because I believe that people should stay together. So that's just.
Yeah, so in those cases where it's really that difficult, talk to each individual separately. I mean, if you feel compelled by the Lord, then I would have both of them talk to somebody separately. Because a lot of times, whatever feelings I'm talking about here, if they don't feel safe getting that vulnerable with each other, it does make it difficult. Like if somebody just decides not to dance, you can't make a dance happen. Right, that statement that it takes two to tango is very true. So there has to be some level of motivation, but once that motivation is present, there is something you can do. You can activate that motivation and make use of it. You can deploy that piece there. But yeah, if somebody's like in a place where they're just refusing to try, I mean, even God himself has to acknowledge to some people he won't be able to save because they refuse. Right? So I'm not saying that is not something that can happen, but if you can catch that individual and find out what those basic motivations are, you can tend to re-engage them if they're at least willing to have the conversation. And that's usually for me, that's about all I need is just a willingness to actually just be able to have the conversation. But if they're not willing to do that, then there isn't a lot of things you can do because you can't chain people up and make them talk to each other. It doesn't tend to work anyway. So does that answer the question though? But, okay, all right. Other questions? Because maybe you all know people and maybe you have questions for yourself, but any other questions that you all can think of, things that, I mean, certainly I want to make sure that I can avail you all of any information I can. Like I said, I can't go through, all 7 steps for these kind of conversations, but I can certainly share with you just some highlight points to make sure I'm answering questions you might have. All right, going once, going twice. All right. So one of the things that, before we wrap up here, one of the things that I will share with you all is that one of the things that tends to bring a conversation back around is focusing more on emotions than just content. Like so much of what is keeping a dance going are the emotions that people are experiencing. If you can connect with the emotions, then you have a much better chance at connecting with the person. Just simply connecting with thoughts and ideas is not sufficient to really connect with people. You all notice the same thing happens in the Bible. You can read what the sermon that Peter preached in Acts 3, but that does not necessarily result in 4,000 baptisms. Anybody ever notice that? Wouldn't that be nice, though, if you can just open Acts 3 and say those exact words like it was a formula and then everybody would just get baptized? That'd be lovely if you could just get something like that going. But it was how Peter said it. That's usually the part that we're missing out on, and it's usually that right there is an emotional appeal. It's something that appeals to the heart. I'm not saying emotions come over facts, but what I am saying is that those two things have to go together if we're going to have anything that looks like love. All right. Okay, so any last questions here before we maybe have a closing word of prayer? Okay, all right. If not, then yeah, we'll come on up.
Great. I just want to thank you. Thank you so much. Did you guys appreciate the presentation? Yeah, no, hey Dave, this is just a token of our appreciation.
Oh, thank you.
For spending your time. You're busy. You have a career. You are an elder in the local church in Centralia, and we feel that you were very kind and generous to give us the weekend. So thank you.
Yeah, no, it's been my pleasure. Yeah.
Appreciate you so much, and you're welcome here anytime. We look forward to ministering together with you as partners. Even though you guys are down the road.
Yeah.
But, yeah, thanks so much. And let's just have a word of prayer together. I'll let you close the prayer. But thank you so much, brother. I just wanted to give this to you in front of everybody.
Yeah, no, thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
It's just a small token.
Yeah, no worries. Wasn't expecting
You guys
anything.
don't know that David and I, we've probably hung out 3 or 4 times, and every time we do, it's like 2 hours of intense, awesome conversation. And his wife and my wife are just like, okay, guys, okay. But no, it's just awesome. I really like you and respect you, and thank you so much for sharing. It's been awesome.
Yeah, well, thank you all for your time and attention. Yeah, for sure. Yes. So it's Sue Johnson. Yeah. And this particular one also has Kenneth Sandifer, but the name of it is Created for a Connection. Sorry, let me show you that book real quick. Yes?
My wife just said it's not true. She's not rolling my eyes when you guys
There you go. Well, that's good. I'm glad. Hopefully we're not making you all suffer too much. Yeah, I talk a lot, as you all can probably tell. I can talk for long periods of time. All right. Excellent. Okay. All right. Well, if that is all, then I will go ahead and have a word of prayer, and then I'll also be around for a few minutes because some people I know you might have questions, but maybe they feel like they'd be easier to ask in private, so I'll make sure that I avail you of that. Maybe just one quick question I will ask everyone is like, if we could put on a workshop that was like specifically delved into the details, which would be a smaller setting where people are actually exchanging with one another, do you all sense that people would be interested in something like that? It doesn't have to be you necessarily, but do you sense that people might be interested in something like that if we were able to put that on? Okay. All right, excellent. So I will try to keep you appraised of that as soon as we get to that place. I didn't mention it, but I'm also in school, so this is part of the reason why it's really difficult. It's been a little bit of a challenging weekend, but I like being able to use this for some form of ministry, so we'll keep it. Yeah. Yes, the mental health symposium dates. Yeah, no, healing traumatized brain, but when's the dates? Okay, October 6th and 7th, there will be a mental health symposium that's going to be focused on trauma. And so if you know people who have experienced trauma, you yourself have experienced trauma, we are going to be, there's going to be three of us as presenters there. I don't know how many people know who Jennifer Schwerzer is. She recently got her PhD in clinical psychology. Yeah, she's been on 3ABN. She also sings, but she got into the field of mental health and is also specialized in trauma, especially trauma in the church setting. So she'll be doing her presentation on that. I'll be talking about the neurobiology of trauma, how it affects the brain, and how you can begin to heal it. And then we have Shannon Vega, who's also a therapist who works in the same office I do in Chehalis off of Market Boulevard. She'll be doing a presentation on how trauma affects young people and children. And so if you're interested in that and you believe people in the community be interested in that, please invite people. I believe it's a wonderful way to be able to reach people with the truth of the gospel that is designed to heal not just the soul, but also the mind as well. So I believe so. I think there's actually flyers up front right now too for it that are up towards the front. So yeah, that'll be there, and then I think we'll have more flyers as we get a little bit closer to the date. So, okay. Any other questions before we close with prayer? Okay. Well, let's go ahead and have a word of prayer, and then like I said, if anybody has any questions to ask me directly, then I'll stick around. Our Father in heaven, we just thank you again so much for the blessing of connections that we are able to have with each other. Lord, and I thank you for the gift of marriage, Lord, and I pray that you would bless every marriage that's represented here and those with whom we are connected, Lord, because some of us are here because we want to find out ways to make breakthroughs for ourselves, and others are here because we know other people that we know are suffering in their relationships. And I just pray, Lord, that even though this is just like the surface here, just the tip of the iceberg of things that we can begin to identify, Lord, I pray that you would help us to be able to break these cycles and patterns in our communication with each other. And that if there are larger cycles in our own lives, Lord, even in our relationship with you, I pray that you would also help us to make those connections to you so that we can break free from these dialogues as well. And I just pray that you would bless every person here and that you would keep us safe and bless the remainder of this time we spend in the Sabbath hours. I pray in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right. Well, many blessings, everyone.